Gospel according to Mark. Glory to you, O Lord. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them, with them, Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down from the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. The Gospel of the Lord. Grace and peace and hope to you from the God who loves you. Amen. The ancients believed that encounters with the holy happened on mountaintops, or at least in high places, where they believed a person could be just about as close to heaven and to God as one could get. The Irish and the Celts call encounters with the holy thin places. Thin places. Places where the veil between this world and the next, is so sheer that it's easy to see through, or even step right through to the other side. A thin place where sometimes the holy comes shining right through. On the mountain with Jesus in our gospel for today, Peter, James, and John find themselves in such a thin place, when suddenly Jesus is transformed before their very eyes, shining in glory. In one of my favorite books, Traveling Mercies, anybody else, by Anne Lamott, author Anne Lamott describes such a moment, such a thin place, a moment when she caught a glimpse of God's glory, of the holy shining through. Lamott tells a story from the 80s of one of the newer members of her own congregation, Ken, who was dying of AIDS. Ken had a totally lopsided face, she says, but when he smiled, he was radiant. Ken said he would gladly pay any price for what he found in this local Presbyterian congregation, none other than Jesus. Jesus and a community that really, really lived, even in its brokenness, the love of God. Now, in the congregation, there was also a woman named Renola, who was large and beautiful, jovial and as devout as she could be. Renola sang in the choir. And if the truth be known, she had always been just a little standoffish to Ken. Renola always looked at Ken with confusion, for you see, she was raised to believe that his way of life and that he was an abomination. And it had been hard for her to break through this early learning. Lamott says that Renola and a few other women at the church were, in fact, just a little bit afraid of catching the disease. Now, Kenny came to church almost every week, He missed a couple of Sundays when he got too weak, but then he was back. And now he was there every week, seeming to weigh almost no pounds at all. Even so, during the prayers of the people, Kenny talked joyously of his life and grace and redemption and of how safe and happy he was feeling. This particular Sunday, the first hymn they sang was Jacob's Ladder. You know, every rung goes higher, higher, right? Well, ironically, Kenny couldn't even stand up. But he sang away, anyway, while sitting down with the hymnal on his lap. Then it came time for the second hymn. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. The pianist was playing, and the whole congregation had risen up. Only Kenny remained seated, still singing. And as they began to sing, "Why should I feel discouraged? Why do the shadows fall?" Well, it was just then that sanctuary became a thin place. For as Brinola watched Kenny, her face began to melt and to become distorted like Kenny's. And Brinola went to his side and bent down, and she lifted him up, that thin scarecrow of a person, and she held him in her arms as they sang. And then they both began to cry. Tears were streaming down their faces, and as she held him, she lay her weeping face against him, putting her face right against his, letting all those spooky fluids mingle together. Here, indeed, was a thin place, a moment of transformation, of metamorphosis, a moment when the holy, when God's glory was shining through the veil that surrounds us. At the transfiguration, the transformation described in our gospel for today, Peter had an idea, saying, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." For Moses and Elijah had also appeared shining in glory with Jesus. I can identify with Peter. I want those rare experiences of the holy to last forever. Some of you might receive a gift maybe next weekend at the winter retreat at Leavenworth. I'm sure many of you are going. To be sure, mountaintop experiences are definitely a gift from God. And I'm guessing if you close your eyes right now, you will be able to bring one to mind. We can reminisce about our experiences today, even with the aid of selfies, in such a way that leads us to disengage from the world, or we can allow them to prepare us for what God calls us to do next. Jesus didn't respond to Peter's ideas about building dwellings on the mountaintop. Instead, a voice came from heaven, from the clouds, saying, "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." In my imagination, I can almost hear the phrase bouncing off the mountains. Listen to him, listen to him, listen to him. And as if to underline those words, suddenly the disciples saw only Jesus. Careful listeners will pay attention to what happens next in the gospel story. For the disciples follow Jesus down from the mountain as he tells them not to speak of the mountaintop vision until after his death and resurrection. Down from the mountaintop, Jesus got back to work. The disciples following and listening to his words and actions, healing and feeding, blessing and welcoming, restoring community, calling the rich and the powerful accountable, freeing ordinary folk from the unjust systems that kept them bound, all on his way to Jerusalem and the cross. And nowhere is there the slightest hint of Jesus taking power over people or becoming Messiah through military might or the like. Dear friends and partners in following Jesus, here we are, you and me, about to begin our Lenten journeys of transformation and renewal in the wilderness, hearing again Jesus' promise of life, shining and lighting our way to Easter. We are never quite sure where our Lenten journeys will lead us, but we do know death and resurrection will somehow be involved. Today's gospel invites us to listen to Jesus to learn the way. So it was that Renola, filled with the welcoming love of Jesus week after week in worship, together with the first disciples, listened to Jesus and began to be transformed. It wasn't enough just to sing in the choir anymore. Renola was moved to become the community who surrounded and lifted Kenny with God's welcoming, healing, freeing, full of tears, love. And so it was here at University Lutheran, as you received God's love for you in bread and cup week after week, year after year, you with the disciples listened to Jesus and began to be transformed. It wasn't enough to just come to worship anymore. You began to listen to the world around you and began shouting, "We choose love," in as many different concrete ways, such as partnering with UW Lutherans in campus ministry, Teen Feed, Sanctuary Arts, and Faith Action Network, forming a nonprofit, Elizabeth Gregory Home, with traditional housing and day center for women who are unhoused. Even stretching internationally to Tanzania with the Alanga School Project and with Lutheran World Relief making quilts for refugees, this month's special offering. And this is only a partial list. This Wednesday, Ash Wednesday, we begin the journey of Lent. We will be marked with the sign of the cross in ashes, the very sign marked with oil on our foreheads in baptism, when God said to us, "You are my beloved child. With you I am well pleased." We are marked with the cross, making the direction of our journey clear, and also making it clear that God travels with us to all the dark places of our lives and the world's. Gathered around the table, Holy Communion becomes a thin place for us. For in this bread and cup, Jesus, God's very self, steps through the veil, choosing to dwell with us. Jesus looking down, coming down, leading us down from the mountain to get to work with us. Jesus promising to be our light, accompanying us to all the challenges ahead. Jesus entering all the dark places of our lives and the world's. Today we are invited to turn toward the one who is already turned toward us. God's love, held out in Jesus' outstretched arms on the cross, are Renola's arms, picking up Kenny in gentle but firm embrace, crying with us. Listen to Jesus, whose love for you is stronger than death. Amen.